Aperture Priority, show number 10. How much editing is too much?
Welcome to the Aperture Priority Podcast, an Avila Studios production where it's all about photography and fun. Now open up that aperture and let some creative light in.
Hello and welcome to Aperture Priority Show number 10. We hit the Big 10.
Oh, double digits. Wow.
Yeah, I'm moving up. And today I have with me Mr. Joe Engelbrecht.
Good morning.
Good morning. And let's start off with the news.
Oh, well, it was midnight somewhere last night, and Nikon made their big announcement, and got the email, and I thought, must be midnight on the East Coast, because being on the West Coast, it wasn't the 23rd yet.
Yes.
So it's a big announcement, and I'm amused at the reaction.
Oh, yes, most definitely. As soon as when you emailed me, I also got an email from Nikon saying, hey, blah, 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 welcome to, their big announcement, their future, and everything, their hype. And as I got that, I went directly to YouTube, and I was amazed how many photographers, without having touched this camera yet, and I don't think they were beta testers, where they already had their opinion on it. Epic fail and everything. And I've gotten to the point, does anybody actually touch something before they read a spec and to see how it actually works?
Well, it seems to be a sign of the times that not only can I have an opinion, but you're entitled to my opinion. And you should hear it. Even though I may not have had a lot of experience with what I'm talking about, I still have an opinion. And that's what amuses me, is that the criticism that I was reading, when they were criticizing features that they couldn't have possibly know about yet, and unless they had the camera in their hands. So I don't know. I think it's all about this rush to get there first and to get the attention and
exactly
that kind of thing.
Yeah. And it was funny. I finally saw the spec on the lens opening, and it was what I initially heard it was going to be 55 millimeter, but it's funny how over time it went from 55 to 65 to 73.
Oh, right. The speculation.
Which would have made it a pretty big camera. So, and it's also interesting, there was no APS-C. They were both full frame.
Full frame, yes.
And I think that's a smart move. Just concentrate on one thing for now. I look at it, if I want an APS-C, there's nothing wrong with APS-C. I like my Fuji. Maybe Nikon should just concentrate almost back when they were just a 35 millimeter film camera.
Yeah.
They just did 35 millimeter film.
They didn't venture into any of the medium formats. They've excelled in that one area. And that's a great marketing approach, is to own your part of the marketplace.
Right. So I was glad to see that. I'm glad I don't think there's going to be different flash systems. So I think all the Nikon flashes should work with it. I didn't read anything on that, but I looked at the pin configuration. So that I think that's good. Mm-hmm. And I did see the adapter. I didn't see, it was pretty late. I didn't see any pricing on the adapter, if it comes with the adapter. But it looks like the adapter will work with all the GS lenses, not the screw drive. I know some people were griping about that. And here's the thing. I have used the digital mirrorless cameras for a couple of years now with my Fuji. There are third-party manufacturers that make adapters.
Right. Metabones and
others. All that.
Right.
So there'll probably be a slew of others. I did like to see the roadmap of the lenses. That was good. Mm-hmm. I'm really interested in the Noct one, the 58.0 0.95. I'm sorry.
0.95. There you go.
And it's manual focus. And I was like, interesting.
That is interesting, isn't it?
So it is, are they, I'm going to assume that they must have nailed it with their focus peaking. For those of you who've ever used manual lenses on a digital mirrorless, it helps with the focusing. Why I'm really interested, I have the Nikon 50 millimeter 1.2, and I have tried to focus it on my my Nikon when I had the D300 at the time, and it has the focus assist. But trying to focus with something at 1.2, I could not nail it. I'd have to rock back and forth and just go click, 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 click.
Yeah, I know the feeling.
So I'm curious what they put in, I really want to get my hands on it.
That's the next step. Yes.
So that's the next step. So I think overall, I think they did good. I know there's a lot of serious complaints about the not having 2 card slots and everything, but I want to feel the camera. I want to see the menu system. I want to see the picture quality.
Right. And that brings us to the question of the mailbag that we got. And that is, what's the big deal about mirrorless? Should I abandon the DSLR and move to mirrorless? That's a question I've been hearing a lot in the last 3 or 4 months. And what do you think? I mean, what you're a mirrorless?
I do own a mirrorless. My first initial impression, the first time I touched one was the Sony A7. And at first it's like being a kid at the toy store. It was new and shiny.
Right.
But over time, it was like, I didn't care. And then when I picked up the Fuji, I had that prejudice in me because I thought I wasn't impressed. But then the quality of the Fuji and how it was built and the features I liked. Then I started carrying it more with me, and I did some shoots just with it. Then I liked that it was lighter. But I look overall, do I get great images? Yes. Do I get great images with my Nikon D700? Yes. I just factor in, what am I comfortable with?
Right.
Is mirrorless the future? It looks like it's the future. Should you consider it? I guess, but I don't see DSLRs going away. I look at it, that old saying, what's the best camera to have? Yeah. It's the one you're carrying with you.
Right. So the big advantage of mirrorless is, that's always been touted, is the weight.
The weight.
It's a smaller body.
It's a smaller body, yes.
The critique of that, though, is that the lenses are bigger because of the physics of the focal point. And you can use the Metabones adapter, for example. You can put on Canon lenses on a Sony A7R, but it adds weight.
Exactly.
So the question I'm asking that I've been asked is that really a weight savings when you have to add the adapter, or you buy the native lens, which is larger than the DSLR lens? Is it truly a weight savings?
The way I look at it is, I have used an adapter, the bigger lens, and with the Sony, I know their newer one, they worked on the grip system. Because right off the bat, when you look at the Z6 and Z7 of the Nikon, I think Nikon nailed it with the ergonomics. I think because they've been a camera manufacturer for longer. That's not a knock against Sony, but when Sony started making these digital cameras, they bought Minolta. Did they keep the camera designer, the body designers, or what happened there?
Every corporate takeover, yeah.
It's like, you guys, thank you, bye. Out the door you go.
Right.
So that was my problem with the Sony, because when you use it with their G Master lenses, which are their top of the line lenses, it doesn't feel right balance wise. And if you look at their lens opening, how the back of that lens tapers down, I know that's been one of the things that that was initially the E mount was a APS-C mount. Because if you look inside of it, that 35 millimeter sensor barely fits in there.
It's a tight fit.
And I think that's been one of the things that they've struggled trying to get these lenses to
align with the sensor, right? That
where Nikon made this new mount, it was not APS-C. They did not use their F mount. I think there should be, in theory, better. And plus, they make their own lenses,
right?
Where Sony, I think. They brand them. I think they're mainly Zeiss makes them, and maybe somebody else, but I think it's mainly Zeiss.
So the advantage that Nikon would have in this competition is that they are native camera manufacturers going back decades, but they also make their own bodies, their own lenses. They have a lot more experience in the ergonomics, which is going to be helpful in their competition against Sony in the mirrorless market. The question then, should I switch from DSLR to mirrorless, is maybe.
The thing that I would, honest to God, tell anybody, and this goes back to an earlier show, which I had Rudy from Horn Photo, is actually go to a store and feel for yourself.
And pick it up. Right.
Is this what I'm going to want to use? You could order it by everybody's recommendation, but I would say actually feel it. Is this going to be lighter? Put a lens on and compare, just kind of like almost what we used to do back in the day. And so, and I say this because I worked at a camera store, so I kind of know this. The other thing now I look at Nikon announced, what's Canon going to do? Are they going to keep the EOS mount, which they already, I think, redid 20 or 25 years ago when they came from their old, was it the Canon FD mount? I can't remember. So what are they going to come out with?
Right.
So competition is good. I don't want to seem like I'm knocking the Sony, but again, I have friends who have just cameras galore. They've used many different cameras systems. I found the ones that use Sony have had problems. And I've heard the new Sonys are nice. It's true they've had this 5.5, 6 year lead, and they've done a lot in that time, and they've gotten better. But you look, in 5 years in today's world in technology, that's ancient. I mean,
right.
They had that lead, and it took them this long to create a camera that's more ergonomically. Like, why didn't you do that before?
They didn't know, did they?
And they say, well, it's great to hear that they take the pros input. Well, yeah, that's always good. But the other thing is, when it comes down, and my friend's running into this, he has to send his in for repair. He sent me the message of what the repair center is saying the problem is with this white pixels. It's like they have to replace the back of the camera. And so I said, did they tell you it's a light leak? I thought that's kind of odd. I kid with him. I said, it's going to cost you $350. I told him, I got some super glue and duct tape. I'll fix that light leak real good.
You can fix anything with baling wire and duct tape and super glue.
So I look at it. Okay. But I want to feel the new Nikon in my hand. I want to see these lenses, because their lenses, they're saying they're S, and they're supposed to be their top of the line now, and they're all S. The price went up on a basic 50 millimeter. I want to see how good that is I really want to, the street price, or suggested retail, I think it was 600. I think I got that from one of the YouTube guys complaining, but I want to see what the actual price is going to be and how good it is. Then I'll make my decision there, because honestly, I'm happy using my D700 and now I'm testing a D800 I may buy for my friend, and I'm happy with those. And it's great if I decide to switch in the future. There's an adapter right now. I could do that. I'm not worried about the roadmap for Nikon lenses, because I know they can produce lenses.
Right. And they are very conscious, and it's a great strength of theirs to take into consideration the great investment people have made in their lenses. So the price points for these two new digital cameras that Nikon has come out with, they're in the 3,000 to 4,000 north of those ranges. That's a pretty good price for a mirrorless entry, and I was a little surprised that it was that much. I mean, the 850, which has almost the identical specs of the Z7, is less, quite a bit less than $4,000. And I thought, that's an interesting.
Exactly.
Right.
I look at it, okay, I was paying a lot of money, let's say at their time, they were competing with Nikon and Canon, but I don't think their ergonomics were there. I don't think the build quality there, because what I hear about how Nikon tests their camera, there's a great video how they test the weather sealing on their D850s. I mean, Nikon really...
That was extreme, wasn't it?
Yes, they really do. And there was some guy on YouTube that tested the D850 versus at the time it was the A9, Sony A9, and they put it out in the rain and the A9 leaked where the Nikon didn't. And I don't know if that's because the Sony's putting so much into a small body, and I guess after a while, and the heat issues I've heard. And again, I've had a friend, and he's tested cameras, and he switched away from Sony and went back to Canon, and then he switched to the Fuji H1 to do his video and shooting. So he uses these a lot, and he uses it for video. I would say that the Sony's video are great, and I'm not a video guy. I've seen the quality of it.
I cut my teeth in the video business on Sony professional cameras, and I often wondered why they didn't make still cameras. I was been a Nikon Sony guy all my life in that regard, and you're right. Sony makes a great video camera, and they've never been able to translate that successfully into still cameras until this recent iteration of the mirrorless. So the final answer is know what kind of photography you want to do and go find the best tool for it.
Right. And please, for God's sake, test your camera, pick it up and see if this is what you're going to want, because if not, it is an expensive tool to buy.
It's an expensive paperweight.
And if it's not what you want, I mean,
go move on to something else.
Move on to something that's going to get you what you want. Again, test it. It's maybe in the future we're going to get today. We just mail order our cars and not do the test drive anymore.
Right.
And then we don't want it. We send it back.
Exactly.
And because you usually get charged a shelving price.
Mm-hmm.
So I would test it, and again, or even rent it when it comes out if you want to wait.
That's the best idea. Rent one.
Yes.
For a few bucks.
So I kind of want to do a correction from the last show. I was talking about my Synology server, and I said it was a 4 gigabyte mirrored system. It's a 4 terabyte. So
that makes a little more sense.
Yeah, it's like 4 gigabytes. It's not going to last too long.
No, that's like one shoot, isn't it?
And then I went back into ON1 and I did some more testing. There's 2 issues I have with ON1. It's an over sharpening issue that I'm getting the haloing from.
I see.
And since I did the last update, there were 2 updates back to back, not too long. I think I need to dump my preference file because I think there's an issue with that. Because when I go to export, it bypasses the dialogue. It just
goes straight to export. Okay.
So I think that's a preference issue. I wish they would do what Lightroom does and gives me a dialog box that pops up instead of how their modules work.
Yes.
Just personal preference. But I think part of the issue I'm having is, I want to be fair to them, is
over sharpening. And that would certainly produce the halos that we've been describing.
Good. So I wanted to make that that correction from last time.
In the spirit of transparency.
Yes. So I figure we'd go into today's subject right now, and this is a great question. How much editing is too much?
Well, the question is really revolves around this idea of purism that I see in photography. And you and I were talking the other day, and I was relating an experience I had in a gallery showing, and there were 2 or 3 artists being displayed, one of which was a black and white, a photographer using film, black and white film, retro, a young lady that recently graduated from college, from photography school in the Bay Area. And she was showing off her black and whites. And then there was some another photographer there that was using a DSLR digital format, a Nikon, I believe it was. And the owners of the gallery had set their 2 images of Half Dome side by side. So I was standing there looking at a black and white image and a color image by 2 different photographers. And the black and white was very flat. The trees in the bottom were just silhouettes. There was no dimensionality, no third dimension at all. The sky was white with a trace of maybe a hint of a cloud. And then the digital photograph adjacent to it, the trees were 3-dimensional. They had light and darkness. There was a lot more contrast, a lot more vibrancy to the print. The clouds were visible. And so I was talking to my companion there, and I was critiquing the photos, not knowing the photographer was standing behind me, listening, overhearing my conversation. I said, it appears that this image, the black and white, is straight out of the camera. Nothing was done to it in the darkroom. It's just straight. And the young lady interrupted me and said, that's exactly right. And that's the way it should be, is that it's straight out of the camera. I'm a purist. That's the reality. That's real. And I said, okay. So there's that argument about she would postulate that any editing is too much. And I thought, and so I've been thinking about that. And of course you can read the forums, and this is a hot topic, but, there's two ends of the question. No editing, I think, is probably not the position I would take, nor is over processing. So where is that happy medium for you, Tony? Where is that middle?
Right. That's a great question. And here's the thing. When she processed that black and white, well, that's almost editing it. How long did you leave it in the chemistry?
Exactly.
So there's a lot of variables. Here's something, and this happened last night. A friend of mine, David, who I started the show with, he calls me up, and he had a new prop. So I went over, and he had these old cameras. One was an old Minolta rangefinder, another one was a Polaroid. So he's going to try some Polaroids.
I see.
Because if you think about it, the Polaroid, you shoot, and it was the old one where you slide out the film and you had to do so many seconds.
Right, and then peel the paper, yeah.
So I would say, well, that Polaroid, boom, it's how you shot it. But here's the problem with that Polaroid, unless you have one picture. So let's say you're going to do a show and you're a purist, you have all these Polaroids.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you sell them, you don't have your original anymore.
Right.
But what if you say, okay, I'm going to scan it in as is and have a digital file?
Mm-hmm.
Well, as soon as you scan it in, bring it up to Photoshop, say, okay, let me just do a little adjustment layer. Oh, while I'm at it, there's a leaf there. Let me just clone that out real quick. I think as soon as you scan it in or bring it in digitally, you're going to manipulate it.
Exactly. So the question is that the purists that I've run into have this attitude or this presupposition that there's this unwritten rule out there that only photographs that come straight out of the camera are acceptable.
Right.
And I've tried to drill down on exactly where that attitude comes from. And I think it springs from photojournalism, not the art side of photography. And so there was a photographer in, I think, Argentina, or maybe it was Brazil, that made the news, unfortunately. His name is Marcio Cabral. And he won a wildlife contest, a major wildlife contest. He had a wonderful nighttime image of a termite mound with specks of bioluminescence termites and an anteater at visiting the termite mound. Once in a lifetime shot. As it turns out, though, evidently, the accusation was made that the termite, or the anteater in the photo was a taxidermy model that he had placed there.
Mm-hmm.
Quite a firestorm. And he was stripped of his contest. So I was reading about other contests, losers, that won the contest and then they were disqualified. And the list goes on. This particular photographer was disqualified because they replaced the sky in their image. It wasn't cloudy enough, or there were no clouds in the sky, so he put a picture of clouds in there. And there's a site from World Press Photo that even has a series of videos that says, okay, here's what's acceptable and here's what's unacceptable when you enter our contest. And that's a photojournalism site. And they're very strict, and they disqualify 20% of their entries because they've been manipulated, is the term they use. Well, I think it's easy to point out too much photo editing. And again, neither one of these things are bad. They're just an approach. And when does photography blend into fine art? Well, when you remove that leaf from the image, that is no longer what the picture was that you took, but it becomes art. Mm-hmm. And so this blurry line between photography and art is hard to nail down. Too much manipulation is when I think the bottom line is when you misrepresent your photograph as something that was there and you don't correct that misunderstanding. When you present a photograph to your audience and you say, this is the way it was, but it really wasn't that way when you took the photograph. That's too much. I mean, that's I think, the problem that underlies the question.
Now, the interesting thing is I too have worked for a newspaper. And the interesting thing with the anteater, I would throw this in. What if when they were doing a story to cover anteaters, there's none around, you're going to put something in there because, again, I've worked for a newspaper, right. So if we're doing a story on this, maybe a certain thing isn't there that you may have to edit in, or I would have to do the illustration on, because you're trying to depict a certain story.
Yes.
So you're not always going to have certain things. So let's say it's midsummer here in the valley. There's not a cloud in the sky for yet months to come, and we're doing a story on something in the winter. So we're going to either have to recreate that. So there's going to be that. That's how I look at it. Purism. Again, I went to an art school, and what I could tell you, you're always going to have debates. Oil painting is the real thing. No, acrylics. No, watercolor. Pencil's the true art. You're always going to have debates. The only thing I would suggest to users, if you have an image and if you spend a long time on it, no matter what you do, and it doesn't look good, and then you decide to go run one of these things and it looks like a pencil drawing, and you say, wow, and everybody says, wow. It's like, maybe you should go back to the basics and try to figure where you went wrong and to correct the capture.
Right.
But the way of editing is you're telling your story of what you shot. So dodging, burning, and doing some of the things does not, I don't have a problem with that.
Well, let's go back to the conversation I was having with the purist, and when she said that straight out of the camera is the way to go. Even if you take that supposition and you apply it to film, some of the most famous landscape photographers or portrait photographers manipulated that negative with dodging and burning. Ansel Adams leaps to mind, of course, and he was famous for his darkroom abilities. And so going back to what you said about the Polaroid, no two images of Ansel Adams are identical, because each one of them he would dodge and burn to his liking. So he had very few. I mean, you could take the print and then make a copy of that. But if he were to emerge from the darkroom, he would have manipulated that film. And in my days of film, just your comment about leaving it in the developer for or pulling half of the paper out of the developer for a few extra seconds. Those are all manipulation. And in defense of anybody that wants to do editing, when we take a photograph of a scene, that scene is not represented in the camera at all. The camera is not capable of reproducing what the eye sees, right?
Right.
So the basic justification for any kind of photo editing is to restore the image to the way your eye saw it. We see the clouds in the sky, but the camera paints a white sky. We see the details in the shadows of that same image or that same scene, but the camera makes them so black as to make them indistinguishable. So returning that image to it the way your eye saw it is absolutely not a sin whatsoever.
I agree.
I think the sin is when you misrepresent your image as something that it's not.
Right. And I would have to say, I think, because this is not an election year, but Facebook's become known for that. And many times I see, now it depends on what political spectrum you're on the opposing one, you see an image that has been doctored.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that is an issue. I think in today's world, I don't think people, we don't know what's real and not real. But then let's look at people who take self-portraits anymore with their cell phone.
I haven't seen any of that. What are you talking about? Oh, wait a minute. I haven't seen any today.
and then as soon as they bring it into, let's say, Instagram, they start running those filters.
Oh, yeah.
Wow, my skin looks so good. I look 20 years younger.
Yeah.
So you see it, the edit, it's everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
How many times I seen those dog ears, nose and the tongue on, they thought, hey, it was cute the first time,
Right.
So it has become the funny thing. Many times I tell you, I was one of the first, users around here, Photoshop. And I go back to Photoshop to 1992.
Mm-hmm.
And when I would talk to people, when I worked at Albert Studio doing digital, what program is that? Microsoft Paint? And I was like, no, this is Photoshop. I used to go up north to, it's around, it's above, Hayward. That's and I used to be with a group of models and photographers, and we would have this mansion. We'd have access to it. So we'd go on a Sunday, and it was great. The guy had a lagoon in the back. It looked like a mini Gilligan's Island.
Oh, yeah.
So we would go back there. It was like a meet and greet. How I knew editing was going to come to its day was the first time a model, when you were shooting her, she goes, Photoshop this out.
Right. The noun became a verb.
Yes.
And that is the other knock, is that there's a critique, and a valid one in my opinion, about how Photoshop has been abused to enhance beauty and create an image that doesn't exist. And too much editing, when we take a photograph of someone, that most of the time, that person wants us to put them in the most flattering light.
Yes.
Well, Photoshop can do that. We can remove wrinkles, and we can, we joke about it, but you can overdo it. You can make a 75-year-old man look like a 19-year-old, but it looks so artificial that.
Yes. So
my question is, or my question is, how much is too much editing when you're talking about the human subject?
Right. That's a great point, and I'm glad you brought that up. A couple years back, actually, it's probably more like 5 years back, I worked with a local model. She was really cool, and we were talking, and she had done a photo shoot up north. I think it was in Modesto. These two guys, one would shoot and the other guy would do the editing. And she said, they're both learning. The guy who shot had an eye. The editor over edited. She was so airbrush. Her face was flat. He would go back in and airbrush the highlights. she started looking like a block person. So, and she told me, she goes, can you check these out for me?
Yeah.
Just get what you think. Cause she asked me, how long have you been using Photoshop? And I said, well, quite a while back. And when she showed me the images, it was like, wow. They were so painted, but she didn't need it. But I think sometimes, and this happens, I guarantee you, anybody new to photo editing will go crazy. And then you're like, oh, wow, I can make it look like a Van Gogh or something.
Right.
And you've gone a little too far.
Well, the tools are there to use, right? I mean, why would they put the tools in there? Let's use them. Let's use them all. So my analogy is this. Using Photoshop is kind of like making a stew. You have your basic ingredients, white balance, highlights, shadows, contrast. All those things are the basic things that every photograph can be improved by using the basics. But then you have a little spice, a little salt, maybe a little pepper, that if you add it to the stew, it really makes a nice tasting stew. But if you overdo the spice, you can't even eat it. And that's what happens with people that overprocess their images, is that they discover Nick or Topaz or On One and all these plugins, and they just go crazy, and they've added half a pound of salt to the stew, and it tastes horrible. So my question about how much is too much for photo editing, I mean, I go back to the days of airbrushing. I used to airbrush.
So did I, yes.
And I still have images that I airbrushed, and I'm thinking, I've been a part of creating this false sense of identity to young people that beauty is perfection. And I regret that in a way. I regret perpetuating the myth that we can only be happy if we have a perfect image of ourselves, a photographic image. That is not so. And I'm really happy to see this trend towards models being real people that are not Photoshop. Now, there is an appropriate use for Photoshop in portraiture, bringing out the color of the eyes, enhancing the features that make that person's individual personality shine. But to radically change their physical appearance, I've seen, and we both have seen examples where someone has edited their body shape to such a point that they are unrecognizable.
Yes, that is very true. And unfortunately, a lot what I do is I'm asked to do that for somebody that say it's going to be on a poster, CD cover. They want that image. You're selling that image. And again, as the graphic artist here, I'm asked to do something and I'm paid to do it. And that's and you do it.
I get it. It's totally.
Yeah. And it's funny, but that brings me, there's a comedian, his name's Chris Rock, and one of his routines, he's making a joke about, life of illusion, how people say, well, you're not that rich. And he says, oh, excuse me, your lips aren't that red. What are you telling me? He goes into this thing, how even in real life, the makeup we put, how we,
with the young lady, the young photographer, I almost said, so you don't wear makeup, but I didn't because I knew better.
Yes. So it is part of our culture. I mean, it is. It just
it's unfair, but it's true, and I'm happy to see that those attitudes are slowly changing. Because I really feel bad that photography has contributed to this illusion that you're only beautiful if you're perfect.
Right. And I want to make a little comment about I made where you get the tools. When I go back to the almost original, I started Photoshop 2.5, but back then their program came out, still out. Corel owns it. It's called Painter.
I recall that.
And I can't remember. I think it was part of Kai's, the company that did Kai's Power Tools. And when you would buy the program, you actually get the CDs or the
floppies.
Floppies.
Yes.
It came in a paint can.
Oh, yes, you did. I remember that. You opened the paint can, and there's a bunch of 3.5-inch floppies in there. A whole stack of them.
So, and when I bring a painter, there was one day I was at one of the shows. I don't know if it was WPPI or the show down in Pasadena, put on by California Professional Photographers or something like that. And you had a guy there. They were, he had the scene was nice. They had the big TV. He had the MacBook Pro and the Initios, and he was showing, look what you can do. And all the portrait photographers are like, wow, I got to get that.
Drooling, yes.
And I look at it, not to be a snob, is like, well, that's so painters so 10 years ago. It's still a good program, but everybody was like, wow, I got to have this. I'm a portrait photographer. I could go in and paint. And it was so overdone, it looked like a painting. And again, that's great, but isn't it a real photograph? Even though it's edited, it's still the capture of the time. I look at the painter thing. They were trying to sell it. I don't want to say gimmick. I don't want to say it's a great tool, but everybody was like, wow, I can make this look like a painting scene.
Yeah.
And it gets to the thing. It's like, well, yeah, I guess you can make it look like a painting, but why not get a real painting then?
Yeah, exactly. Or learn how to paint. So, these tools can be overused, and you could get too involved in it where you start taking bad photos. And again, you start getting and trying to bring life to them. It's when you get to that point, I'd say, let's go back. Was it your composition? Was it how you captured that image? Was it maybe you go back a different time of day? Yeah.
You're overdoing it by.
And there's a valid time to sometimes in travel photography, you don't have the option of going back another time. I mean, it is what it is, and you try to make the best of it. So, too much editing is when you misrepresent the image as something that it really wasn't, whether it's photojournalism or fine art, without revealing that it's been manipulated or things have been added or taken away from the image. And then the other thing is when you put too much spice in the recipe and you're just over processing it to the point where it's not real. That's not a real image.
Right.
The big HDR fad that hit a few years back is a great example of that. Is people push those dynamic ranges way out of the natural scene. So
yes, I remember I was in a local camera meetup group, and I didn't last long because it came to one of the meetups where we met, and everybody brought in their photos. And it's one of those, instead of bringing one, they brought in a gazillion photos.
Oh,
and every shot I'm sitting there was HDR. And if it wasn't, somebody in the group would say, well, why didn't you HDR that?
So this was an HDR group.
And one of the shots, I kid you not, was like a rock by a river. And I guess he was trying to show the texture. And one of the ladies said, why didn't you HDR that? And I thought, that's not the answer. Why didn't he try to recompose it or take a different subject than a flat rock, high noon?
Right.
It just boggled my mind, but that HDR thing and those false colors, but it didn't bother those people. I just looked at it. It just like, oh.
The HDR was the solution to the wrong problem. The composition, it goes back to the basics. Again, the ingredients of the stew, composition, lighting, those are things that you have control over to a degree, and you should. The basics. You have to have the basic meat and potatoes in the stew before you add the spice. The spice is not the meal.
Now, one thing I wanted to bring up before we wrap it up, there's a certain person in our group. I won't mention Mr. Larry.
Oh, right.
He's a great photographer.
Anonymous Larry.
But when he brought in that, it's a great picture. And when he told us he's been working on that for a year and a half, I thought everybody was giving him a bad time. I thought he was ready to throw his laptop at somebody.
Well, there is that misunderstanding that it takes years or hours and decades even to make these images. He was just referring to the fact that he had learned a different set of skill sets and was going back to that image like we all do and go, I think I could do something with that.
Yes.
Which is his famous line.
But it was so funny to see everybody's smile go up because I knew all the wisecracks were coming when he mentioned a year and a half.
Right. Yeah, well, he can take it, yeah.
Well, great. I think that was a great conversation about that. And we'll leave it on the Nikon stuff for now until I actually get to test it. Then I don't want to be one of those guys on YouTube saying epic fail without ever touching a camera. But Joe, where can we find you?
Well, I have a website, www.brightangelimages.com. You can do the Gmail, same, brightangelimages@gmail.com. Those two. Facebook, same thing, Bright Angel Images, and you can reach me there.
Great. You can reach me at theavalastudios.com, Tony Avila 64 on Instagram. I do have the Aperture Priority podcast page up on Facebook. And I think that's about it. I'm hoping to get more traffic there. Anybody wants to visit, ask questions, posts,
comments.
Yeah, bring them on. I think I'd like to see this grow into a bigger conversation.
Right. That's exactly right. It's a conversation.
Great. So let's leave it at, let's open up that aperture and let some of that creative lighting.
Aperture Priority is an Avila Studios production. For more information on what Avila Studios has to offer, please visit us on the World Wide Web at avilastudios.com.